Welcome to another Ask Me session, where I answer your questions about strategy, operations, data, and evaluation for nonprofits, foundations, public agencies, and other organizations providing education, human, and social services. I'm Tamara, your sidekick, here to help you make a bigger impact with less sacrifice. Our first question today is, how can I be more inclusive in collecting demographic data? So first off, one of the things I've seen with demographic data is that people collect it just because they think they need to collect it. They don't actually know going in why they're collecting it or how they're going to use the data. Before you collect any data of any type, make sure that it's necessary. Know exactly why you need it and how you're going to use it. Then communicate those purposes to the people when you're collecting your data. Being open and transparent will help you to build their trust, but also it'll make sure that you have everything in order so you know you're collecting data you really need and you're not potentially harming people by putting them through stress or giving them any experiences in data collection that are for data that really aren't necessary. So make sure that you are collecting only what you really need and exactly what you're going to use. Now, assuming, let's say, that you're really going to need data around gender and race ethnicity. These are the two most common demographic types of data that I see collected, and they're also two of the potentially most problematic. Now, with gender, we frequently see people asking questions like, what is your gender? Or what is your sex? Now, first, sex is linked to biological sex, and gender is the social construction of gender. So when we're asking about gender, we're usually asking about gender and not sex. It's unless you're in a medical study, it's very rare that it's necessary for you to actually know someone's biological sex. And for the most part, people are not actually able to report on their biological sex because they don't know it. Biological sex is something that you would have to actually do physical tests in order to determine. So skip sex and focus on gender. Now, gender is a social construction. It's something that society made up to encompass what they thought to be meaningful categories of people. Now, it's most sensitive and most inclusive for you to not phrase the question as what is your gender, but what gender do you identify with? You don't necessarily want people reporting on what other people perceive their gender to be or what their gender is expected to be, but rather the gender that they actually are and in terms of their own identity. So ask, what gender do you identify with? And then have multiple categories. It is not inclusive to only include male and female. You need to include all of the other potential genders that you can be aware of. Now, I am a cisgender female, and that makes it so I know that I do not know of all the genders that exist. And so what I do is I search for communities of people who are of non-binary, trans, other genders besides my own, and find out how they identify themselves and use their language to the best of my ability. And then, in addition to that list, I add other. So including an other category and allowing people to self-identify will help to make it so that people who don't fit into the categories that you're aware of still have something, a place where they can put who they are. Now with race ethnicity, this can get complicated because race and ethnicity are actually two different concepts. Now with ethnicity, and I do frequently switch the terms race and ethnicity, so I'll have to double check this, but I believe ethnicity is the one where it's Hispanic or not Hispanic. And so if you look at like the US Census, you see a question about, are you Hispanic or are you not Hispanic of origin? And then there's race, which is what we most typically think about when we think about race ethnicity, which is Asian, white, Black, etc. So the problem is that most people don't think of race and ethnicity as two different concepts. And so when they think, for example, I'm not Hispanic Latino, but let's say someone who's Hispanic Latino sees the first question of, are you Hispanic Latino or are you not? or are you Hispanic in origin? Then they're going to say yes. And then they won't feel like they have an answer to the next question of what is your race, because they don't consider themselves to be any of the other categories. So collapsing these concepts is really common. So you have Hispanic, Latino, and then you include them in the list of race, ethnicity, instead of having it as a separate question. But we also want to make sure that we're inclusive in the terms of both gender and complexity or variation of cultures. Now, a lot of the categories we typically have in race collapse people and collapse cultures into very high level categories. So for example, Asian or Black, like these incorporate many, many different people of different cultures that have very different experiences in the world. So it's better to break down into smaller categories. So for example, you could go to like East Asian, Southeast Asian, Pacific Islander in terms of, and that's not to be a comprehensive list. Those are just examples of how you might break Asian down. Or you could get even more specific and go with ancestry. Now with ancestry, we're talking about the countries of which your family originates. And everybody has some ancestral line that they may or may not know of. So thinking about how you can ask people in a way that's sensitive to what cultural background were you raised in. So you might, for example, ask, have response options like African, African American, Japanese, Chinese, and have a mixture of different levels of categories. Or you might have specific, only have specific countries. But be aware that not everyone will know their ancestral lines. And so really there's trade-offs of every single way to ask these questions. The most proximal, so where did you grow up, is going to be the thing that everybody will, for the most part, know and be comfortable answering. So think about why you need to know race, ethnicity, and what you're trying to get at, what level of types of cultural variation is most meaningful, but also how it might be perceived by the person who's responding. I am coordinating a local initiative involving multiple nonprofit partners. So far, the initiative has not gone well. We've had limited engagement for partners and little client participation. Do you have any ideas for how to use the evaluation to get folks engaged in the work? Also, are there any literature or evidence-based ways to use evaluation to modify programs that are midway through implementation? There are multiple evaluation approaches that will enable you to engage your participants or stakeholders, and also to use the results to drive program improvements and modify the program to be more effective. I use all of these approaches to different degrees, more or less and sometimes than others, depending on the context and how things are going. The first is results-based accountability. This is where you set the result. This is the long-term outcome, the measure of the long-term outcome. And you track this over time. You are accountable to whether or not you're changing that outcome. You set short and intermediate term outcomes. Those are the things that would change before that long-term outcome to show whether you're on track or not toward changing your long-term outcome as intended. By regularly tracking results, both in the short and long term, and keeping your program accountable to changing those results, you then make changes to program implementation when you're not going in the direction that you are expecting to. So when your outcomes are not changing, or whether you're not making any progress, that's when you would change your program to do something different to be more effective. This is a little bit rigid. It's very quantitative focused, and it doesn't necessarily take into account the complexity of all situations. I also like to have deeper engagement than results-based accountability frequently emphasizes. This is where you can blend it with other methods or other approaches like collaborative, participatory, and empowerment approaches. Participatory evaluation is when you involve stakeholders at different times of the evaluation, such as during data collection to support those data collection efforts or to help recruit participants, or during data interpretation to interpret the results that came out of your data analyses. So that way they're involved in the process, they've seen a piece of it, and they were a member of a part of it. And this helps to increase buy-in. Deeper engagement is seen with collaborative evaluation. This is where stakeholders are partners on the evaluation team rather than just being involved or asked for input at specific time points. This makes the evaluator an equal level team member with stakeholders in the design and implementation of the evaluation. Now, empowerment evaluation is even going further on the spectrum here, and the evaluator becomes more of a facilitator, and the stakeholders are actually the experts who are leading and conducting the evaluation. They're the ones designing and selecting the data collection methods and tools. They're implementing the data collection, analyzing the data, and doing the reporting and use. So the evaluator is really there just as a support or tool that's helping the stakeholders do the evaluation. In more complex situations, you also may use developmental evaluation. In developmental evaluation, both the program and the evaluation are evolving in real time in order to figure out how to address complex situations and achieve complex outcomes. This is very common for things that are systems change. A system is a very hard thing to move. It's a hard thing to change because there are so many factors at play and so many people in different roles that need to be involved. So with your multi-nonprofit network, you may actually want to be using developmental evaluation. In this approach, you're collecting real-time information about what's happening, the context in which things are happening, decisions that are being made, and what's happening because of those decisions. And the information that comes out of this real-time data collection is then fed regularly back into the program design and implementation so that the program can learn from itself and adapt in order to improve the likelihood of its success. This sort of feedback loop is part of both engaging people in the evaluation as well as using the results for improvement. Another approach that I frequently use is called continuous quality improvement. There are so many different models of continuous quality improvement, such as Plan, Do, Study, Act. There are so many, I can't even list them all. But the purpose of continuous quality improvement is to regularly review and reflect and then act on data from your evaluation or other purposes for data collection. I regularly have monthly continuous quality improvement meetings with clients in order to review evaluation results, talk about what does this mean for the program, what's working and what's not working, and then to create action plans and say, what are we going to change in order to be more effective, to do more of what's not working and less of what's not, or more of what's working, sorry, and more of what's, less of what's not working. So in order to regularly improve, we have this on a monthly basis. We look back and say, did we execute our action plan? How did it go? What resulted because of that? What did the data look like today? What's working, what's not working? And what do we want to do this next month in order to improve? And we use this monthly cycle in order to always be making a little bit of progress toward getting better at what we do. So that's it for today. I will see you every Monday to answer your questions. Submit your questions using the link in the description. If you liked this video, hit like and share it with your friends and colleagues. And don't forget to subscribe so that you can get this video and all of our other videos in your feed regularly. See you next time. Thank you for all that you do.